G'day, my name's Ainsley Campbell and I run a business called Handy Andy Handyman Services. I know this doesn't make much sense, but neither does the story that I want to share with you. Take me Mickey Mouse ears off. It's a story about the Department of Home Affairs and specifically about their entity Australian Border Force, ABF, who operate under the department's umbrella, and their relationship with Serco, which is a massive international service provision company which operates multiple contracts in Australia, predominantly within the justice defence sectors, and which ABF contracts to manages all immigration detention centres in Australia. I'm sharing this video to highlight the actions of Serco, as well as to make people aware of the powers that senior public servants within government bodies such as ABF have to destroy the livelihoods of ordinary Australian citizens. The term public servants is, I believe, an oxymoron because whoever they are serving, it sure as hell isn't the Australian people. I feel there needs to be much more accountability, transparency, and good old-fashioned integrity returned to departmental decision making to ensure Australian citizens retain at least some basic rights. I had to make this video so that I could put this injustice behind me and move on with my life. I've given the department and Serco every opportunity to investigate my concerns, but they consider the matter closed. I've tried to keep this video as short as possible, but it involves some complex issues. So for those of you with busy lives, which is like everybody, I'll raise the main points up front. Firstly, the Australian Department of Home Affairs makes decisions behind closed doors which severely and detrimentally affect the lives of Australian people without any public transparency or accountability for the use of these powers whatsoever. Secondly, Serco, as a contractor to ABF, behaves in a dishonest way with regard to its investigatory and disciplinary processes and does not care for a moment about the lives of its loyal employees. And lastly, there is, in my opinion, a high likelihood that representatives of Australian Border Force collude with their major contractors, such as Serco, to treat contractor staff in a manner which is not consistent with the Australian notion of a fair go, and that they do not have the interests of the Australian citizens or the Australian nation in their hearts or their minds in relation to their decision making. So that's a taster. If you're not interested in going down the rabbit hole, I wish you all the best. But for those that do, this is my story. Since 2009, I have worked at the Perth Immigration Detention Centre when they took over the contract to manage detention centres in Australia in 2010. In 2015, I was asked by my company to apply for the senior position of Facility Operations Manager at my centre and was successful. 2 years ago, on the 24th of April 2020, I was stood down from my position after Australian Border Force made allegations that I had ignored directives contained in an email sent from the ABF superintendent, which gave very specific instructions about how to manage a particularly difficult detainee during my shift. Now, I freely admit that during my shift I made good operational decisions which were contrary to the ABF directives, but this was not because I had ignored them, as silly as they were, but simply because I was never made aware of the directives in the first place. And I have 100% proof of this. You have to remember that as a senior manager, I have to make operational decisions all the time, and it's not reasonable that I am going to check all my emails before commencing my shift. It's also most unheard of for an ABF superintendent to give directions which micromanage an individual detainee to this level, so it was something that would not be normally or reasonably expected for me to look for. Now, incidents did occur during my shift, however they were not particularly substantial. No one was injured, no property was damaged, no laws were broken, and apart from the damage to a few senior egos, there was no reputational damage to the department itself. They were the type of incidents that happen with a regular frequency within the detention environment, and in my opinion, as a long-serving operational manager, they were handled extremely well, with the safety and security of all stakeholders being the highest priority. It should be acknowledged at this point that the email directive sent by the ABF contained false information, which was used to justify the possible unlawful restriction of a detainee's rights. And I would argue that if the directives were followed, it would likely to have resulted in a much more dangerous incident as a result. As it turned out, this shift was to be the last time I would enter my former workplace. Following ABF's allegations, my company launched an investigation at which I explained and justified all of my actions from the outset and was completely consistent and honest throughout, expecting it to be resolved very quickly, in the understanding that I had done nothing wrong. Despite all the evidence being collected very early, the investigation dragged on for months and months and months, but ultimately failed to find any evidence of wrongdoing on my behalf, let alone anything that would warrant dismissal. Despite no finding of wrongdoing, and unbeknownst to me, in July of 2020, Australian Border Force sent a letter to Serco stating that my authority to work at any immigration detention centre within Australia had been permanently withdrawn and that I was not allowed to return to my work site. I'm not sure why ABF couldn't wait till the end of the investigation before making this decision, but to them it appears that the fact that a person is being investigated is in itself proof of guilt. In August of 2020, Serco informed me of ABF's decision to remove their permission for me to be on site that they had received some 2 months earlier. And I asked my employer what were the stated reasons behind the department's actions, to which I received a shrug of the shoulders and an explanation along the lines of, "We are very sorry, but we do not know the reasons. Unfortunately, it's in the contract. It's in the contract. They are allowed to do this. We are very sorry." This was staggering news to me and brought home the reality that I might not get the chance to return to my workplace of the last 11 years or the chance to see many of my work colleagues and friends again. Despite this, I advised Serco that I would be willing to work in any other capacity at any of other Serco's contracts while I appealed ABF's decision. The reply I received was, "We are very sorry, but ABF clearly state that you're not to work in any location within the immigration contract. So sorry." My stress levels built up a bit after this meeting, and a few days later I contacted my company to discuss the strain that I and my family were under and requested if I could use a couple of days of my 400 odd hours of sick leave to get my head together. I was sent an email reply about an hour later while I was at the doctor's, which I later learned had been vetted by Serco's national managers, advising that my employment was terminated effective immediately. See ya. My termination letter mentioned no disciplinary reason for my dismissal, and the only reason cited was simply that it was as a result of ABF's decision to remove their permission for me to be at my workplace, but offered no explanation for the reasons behind this decision. I felt that Serco's actions in my case were about as weak and cowardly as you can get, particularly as my termination was not related to any performance issues and because the company had many other options available to them, all of which I had broached prior to my dismissal. The manner in which my dismissal was conducted after more than a decade of loyal service was also deeply disappointing and made me feel pretty worthless. No invitation to come in for a meeting or an offer for me to resign and perhaps save some dignity, simply a termination letter citing no reasonable grounds sent via email an hour after I had raised legitimate health concerns. I did not actually even read Serco's emails till the following day, as I was at the doctor's when it was sent, and in the meantime my company had informed the officers of whom I manage of the decision even before speaking to me. And it was in fact texts of commiseration from work colleagues, which was the first notification I had of the decision to dismiss me. To me, the way in which Serco orchestrated my dismissal when I was at my absolute lowest point displayed the complete opposite of care, which is a core value Serco proudly cites in its messaging to employees. I felt so strongly that Serco had treated me unfairly that I challenged my dismissal at the Fair Work Commission. Serco must have paid a small fortune to defend their actions, and their argument was basically along the lines of, well, we had no choice to do this because ABF had removed agency's right to be in the workplace. How much Serco contributed to aiding and abetting ABF's decision is unknown. My argument for unfair dismissal was that Serco had many other options available to them apart from dismissal. It's interesting to note that as part of discovery in the Fair Work process, I asked Serco to provide a list of all available jobs they had open at the time that I was dismissed. Serco produced a list which showed almost no jobs available across all contracts of which I could have fitted into. This was very different, however, from the list supplied to me by some former colleagues, which was sourced directly from Serco's internal job shop network, which showed that there were many positions available that I could have easily have fitted into, as I had already indicated that I would be willing to do anything. Serco apologised to Fair Work for this error, saying it was an honest mistake. In late May of 2021, the Fair Work Commission made a finding that Serco had indeed unfairly dismissed me and found specifically that there was no valid reason for my dismissal related to my capacity or conduct, and that Serco had a positive obligation but did little or nothing to actively investigate redeployment opportunities and also ignored all other possible options. Serco had the opportunity to appeal this decision, but quite wisely, in my opinion, chose not to. So it now stands on the public record that Serco does indeed unfairly dismiss its loyal employees. So booyah to you, Serco. Despite spending a fortune to defend your actions, you prove that you do not care about your employees, and the values you profess are hollow, empty rhetoric that's quickly tossed aside if it gets in the way of what personalities within your company or the department want. Simply put, you do not walk your talk. Now, that being said, Serco, I welcome you to prove me wrong. Last week, a friend of mine and a very loyal Serco employee finished a night shift, went home to bed and died in his sleep. I thought I was a good contributor for Serco, but Prippal gave his heart and his soul, literally, and even risked his life for the company on more than one occasion. I am not saying that his sudden and tragic death was the result of the toll that shift work has on the human body, but science is only just coming to the realisation of how damaging a lack of sleep is and how much it contributes to an early death. Prippal has left a wife and 2 small children who are going to really struggle both emotionally and financially to get by in his absence. Serco could certainly never replace the love of a father, but they could help ease the financial burden that this wonderful family will face. Come on, Serco, prove me wrong and show that you really do care for your loyal employees by making sure his wife and his children are adequately looked after. In relation to my case, I must say a big thank you to my legal team, Graham McCorry, as well as the many former and current Serco employees who assisted me, and also my family who were a bedrock of support. I also need to say a big thank you to my support person, Julian Grill, who was with me right throughout the disciplinary process and through a previous and equally baffling disciplinary process in late 2019. Julian is a long-standing family friend and was a former West Australian government minister, and he knows a thing or two about being treated unfairly. He recently published a book called Secret State, which details his accounts of his long-running battle with the Crime and Corruption Commission and its impact on the lives of many innocent people. For anyone who's interested in some of the extraordinary things the CCC were able to get away with, I highly recommend this book. Thomas Percy, who helped launch the book, described it as brave, measured, accurate and extremely poignant, and that it would stand as a seminal work of history for generations to come. So thank you, Julian. I really appreciate your help more than you'll ever know. Now, I don't know why Serco chose not to support me in my hour of need. I've always been a loyal and high contributing employee and maintained good relations with my centre manager. But perhaps other managers saw me as a threat, or perhaps National Office feared my ex-union background and felt I was too close to employees, or perhaps they simply had someone else in mind for my position. All I know is that the decision came from very high up the Serco ladder. Any of these reasons are possible, but I suspect the real reason is simply laziness on behalf of Serco's investigating team and a desire to have operational managers who, when told to jump by Australian Border Force, simply ask to what elevation. After my Fair Work victory case, I contacted my former centre manager, whom I always got on well with, and said no hard feelings, mate, and asked if he could supply a work reference for me, as he'd always signed off on positive work reviews previously. He advised me that he would be happy to, but he would first have to check with Serco National Office if he was allowed to. After my Fair Work victory, I chose not to be bitter, and I left Serco to one side, much the same as they'd left me. But I was still seeking answers from Australian Border Force about how and why the decision to destroy the livelihood of an honest, hard-working Australian citizen came to be made. This endeavour proved to be a long and painful process, akin to banging one's head against the wall. If you visit the website of the Attorney General Department, they state, at least in criminal and civil proceedings, that Australian citizens have the right not only to the presumption of innocence, but also to the right to a fair and open trial before a competent, independent and impartial court or tribunal. In relation to decisions made by governments, however, it appears these rights seemingly do not exist. You may recall the previous Attorney General Christian Porter saying in his defence, after allegations of rape were made against him, that if he were to be stood down from his position because of an allegation about something that simply did not happen, then any person in Australia could lose their career, their job, their life's work based on nothing more than an accusation. Well, I agree with you, Mr. Porter, but at least you received an allegation. I wonder how many other Australians, such as myself, spend the best years of their life working for something simply to have it taken away at the stroke of a pen based on absolutely nothing. In trying to seek answers to my questions of why, I sent letters to the misnamed Integrity Department of the DHA both prior to and after my dismissal, asking for a review of the decision, and did not receive a single acknowledgement. My legal team, who I engaged after my dismissal, also sent letters to the then Minister Peter Dutton's office asking for information, which were also ignored. Even my dad, who for 18 years was a federal member of the House of Representatives for the seat of Kalgoorlie, sent a letter to Mr. Dutton asking for some clarity, but his correspondence, like the rest, was also completely ignored. I mean, the contempt in which the DHA treated my case under Mr. Dutton was truly astounding. I even went to see my local federal member of parliament prior to my dismissal, who advised me that the DHA was a bit of a law unto itself and that he would be likely to receive any positive response to any request for answers, and that my best bet was to appeal the decision through the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, the AAT. I decided to take this course of action, but after seeking legal advice, I was advised that to bring an action to my case to the AAT, I would need to provide a reason as to why ABF had removed my permission to be on site in the first place. So in a classic catch-22 situation, unless I received a reason for the removal of my authority to work, then I would be unable to appeal the decision as to why they had removed it. It looked like there was nowhere to go unless I could appeal to the federal court to get answers, which is a prohibitively expensive option, well beyond my meagre means. But following my Fair Work victory, there was a cabinet reshuffle, and Peter Do-Nothing Dutton moved on to become Australian Defence Minister, while Karen Andrews stepped into the role of Minister for Home Affairs. Following this, my father sent another letter to the new minister, and to her extreme credit, and I mean that most sincerely, Miss Andrews directed ABF to respond to my letter, or to his letter. Consequently, in July 2021, my father received a response from ABF saying that the reasons behind the decision were confidential, but they had in fact been supplied to Serco, and directed my father to advise me to ask Serco for them. This information from ABF was a bombshell to me, because right throughout the disciplinary process, I was led to believe that Serco were on my side and were not aware of the reasons for the removal of my right to be at my workplace. And even during the Fair Work hearing, Serco cited a letter sent from ABF in July 2020 stating that ABF had complete discretion to provide notice to remove any contractor from site and were not required to give a reason. The fact that Serco were aware of the reasons was an extremely important point, in that if I had been told why my authority to be at my workplace had been removed before my dismissal, then I could have appealed the decision and perhaps saved my job. But Serco, however, assuming ABF are telling the truth, chose instead to deliberately keep this news from me, and in fact directed me that I should not attempt to seek any answers from ABF. With this new information from ABF, I contacted Serco and asked for the reasons, stating that ABF had informed me that the reasons behind the decision were in fact provided to Serco. I received an email reply from Serco a short time later advising that if I wanted answers, I should contact Australian Border Force, and also that my employment relationship with Serco had ended and not to contact them again. So I guess this means I won't be receiving a work reference anytime soon, eh boss? So, after finally getting a response from ABF and sending another email to ABF requesting the answers, I finally received in September of 2021 a response from the ABF Commissioner which outlined the reasons behind their decision. The reasons provided related to 3 separate events, with the final and main reason being that I ignored an email directive from ABF sent on the 23rd of April. The first reason cited that I had lost my assigned radio in late 2019. This was related to an incident in October 2019 when I reported to my security manager that my radio had been deliberately stolen by a Serco staff member. An investigation was conducted, but ultimately it failed to find either the radio or the thief, who, by the way, is still working at Perth Immigration Detention Centre. Interestingly, the investigating team chose not to interview me, despite the fact that I had good information about who the thief was, and despite making myself available for interview. By studying the CCTV footage, however, they found that during my shift I had committed some minor security breaches, and I was given a warning as punishment and was also sent to manage another line. Julian Grill, who I mentioned before, was my support person throughout this disciplinary process, and I posted a video onto my Facebook timeline the morning after it happened, which some people may find interesting. I'll get my tech guru to put a link or something on this video. Thanks. It's also interesting that this incident occurred soon after I had got into a little bit of a war of words with another manager about some health and safety concerns that I had raised earlier. I informed my manager soon after this that while I was not going to take the issue any further, that I was feeling targeted and I wanted the harassment from the other manager to stop. I should have perhaps seen the writing on the wall then, but I figured I'd just keep my head down, look after my team and get on with my job. The second incident occurred in March of 2020 and related to my decision to supply the detainees with pizza after one detainee had completely smashed up the dining room to the point that it was too dangerous to enter and had to be closed. I spoke with the detainee and de-escalated a highly dangerous and tense situation before escorting him to the high care room without incident. I then supplied pizzas to the detainees who had not eaten. 2 staff members on shift that night were so impressed with how I managed the situation that they sent me an email thanking me and suggesting that a weekly pizza night, if there were periods of compliance, would be a good initiative. Others, however, were not so impressed. The next day I received an email not of thanks for managing a potentially dangerous situation, but stating that ABF were very upset about my decision to order pizzas. I was not disciplined for ordering the pizzas, however I was advised that I would not be reimbursed for the cost. Still, at least the detainees got to eat that night, I suppose. There's not enough time for me to go into all the details about each of ABF's assertions in relation to these events, but put simply, they presented allegations as fact when in fact they were nothing more than supposition, and bad supposition at that. To be blunt, the 3 reasons provided by ABF were either false, unproven, made unreasonable assumptions, and or were not based on a proper examination of the evidence or an appreciation of the situation. Interestingly, the department's letter from September 21 also informed me that not only had Serco been advised from the outset of the reasons behind ABF's decision, but that ABF had initially only intended to remove permission for me to be on site at the Perth Immigration Detention Centre. And it was only at Serco's request that ABF removed approval for me to work at any immigration detention centre located within Australia. This was another bombshell for me, not only because it raises so many questions of collusion, but because Serco had been advising me and my support person that as much as they would like to move me to another location site, that unfortunately ABF had insisted that I was not to be permitted to work in any capacity within the immigration detention contract. Basically, the reasons provided by ABF to justify their decision were so full of holes that they could have been refuted with any cursory examination of the evidence which I had already provided to Serco during the investigation into events on the 23rd and previous incidents, and which Serco had assured me they had provided to ABF, but which was clearly not reflected in ABF's response. I can see in hindsight that my company never ever supported me, as they claimed, but this, however, does not let ABF off the hook, as it was very senior persons within ABF who made the original decision, and this was made without providing me any chance to appeal or even know why the decision had been made. Now, I come from a security background, and I understand there may, on very rare occasions, be circumstances where the need for secrecy validates the restriction of an individual's rights to due process. But we're not living in mainland China or Soviet Russia, and I am hardly the type of person who fits the profile of a national security risk. I am simply a working class dad and husband with 2 beautiful daughters and 1 horrible mortgage, and I am now facing great uncertainty about how I'm going to provide for my family in the future. I can hear some people saying that the department wouldn't just kick a good employee off site. They must have had a good reason. After all, where there's smoke, there's fire, right? The simple answer is no. Sometimes where there's smoke, there's no fire. There's only mirrors. The truth is that many institutions such as ABF are swamps of bureaucratic self-interest. I know that I did nothing wrong on the 23rd of April, and I suspect the department also knows this, and this is the real reason why they failed initially to provide any response to my request for answers. The reasons finally provided by the department were so baseless that it begged the question that if there was no good reason for their actions, what were the bad reasons? Could the real reason have been an effort to cover up significant errors of judgment and fact and possible illegal actions made by senior ABF officials in relation to the incidents on the 23rd of April? I've raised my concerns about this with ABF, and based on their lack of a response, I'll now be forced to raise them with the Commonwealth Ombudsman in the hope that the truth will prevail. Or perhaps it wasn't related to events on the 23rd of April at all. Was I perhaps targeted because I'm an active member of Sustainable Australia, which is one of the few political parties at a time of record immigration who are calling for significant reductions in Australia's immigration rate? Or were the actions of the DHA revenge served cold because my father, as a former long-standing independent federal member of parliament, was almost a lone voice highly critical of Australia's high immigration rate, which even then was significantly smaller than it is today? Or could perhaps the actions of ABF result from the fact that I wrote to Peter Dutton in January of 2019 asking why Serco was no longer allowed to fly the Australian flag? Minister Do-Nothing Dutton didn't reply to my email at the time, but did his office send an email back to Australian Border Force asking, who is this impertinent troublemaker asking questions about the Australian flag? It's interesting to note that since Mr Dutton has been our Defence Minister, we have heard plenty of tough talk about standing up to China, but seen very little action. And we should not forget that it's been on Mr Dutton's watch that China has signed a deal with the Solomon Islands to potentially set up a military base less than 2,000 kilometres from Australian shores. I wonder if Mr Dutton's little joke in 2015 about Pacific Islanders having water lapping at their front doors was any motivation for this. I wonder also if Mr Do-Nothing Dutton will launch legal action against me for defamation, as is his style. My guess is that he won't, because I have plenty of evidence to back up my claims and have given his former department plenty of time and opportunity to investigate them. In any case, I doubt the Defence Minister would demean himself to fighting someone as unimportant as me. In reality, I doubt that any of the above mentioned are motivations behind ABF's decision to remove my right to work. And again, I suspect the real reasons are rather more basic and mundane. We have to remember that ABF is not a single entity, but rather a human construct made up of many small individuals with enormous power and enormous egos. And many of those egos can be wounded. Poor babies. I suspect the removal of my authority to work was due to a perception amongst some ABF managers that I, as a lowly contractor, simply did not know my place within the system. If I was a direct employee of ABF, I doubt that Australian Border Force could get away with such a blatant abuse of power. But when you are a contractor, you appear to be somewhat more disposable. During the Fair Work hearings, Serco cited that the contract between Serco and the department expressly states that the department had the ability to remove a person's right to work at any time without having to provide any reason. I only got to see one part of the clause in that contract, and I'm not aware if there are other clauses which restrict this right to a unique set of circumstances, but in any event, is such a clause even legal? If we are a nation who proclaims to value a fair go, then shouldn't everyone receive the opportunity to face his or her accusers? If we can't do that, then aren't we just also walking the talk when it comes to the provision of basic human rights? What concerns me greatly is that if the department can forego basic human rights to someone like me, who has the capacity to defend myself, then what are they doing to the people within the system who can't? Now, don't get me wrong, I am a big supporter of temporary immigration detention. That's why I got into the space in the first place. But if we as a nation are going to detain people based solely on their non-visa status, then it has to be done to the highest possible integrity standards. And if I can be treated like this, when the department's own integrity department won't respond to my request for answers, then surely this raises questions about how others, less able to defend themselves, are being treated. In my years of service to immigration detention, I have dealt with many traumatic incidents and have also suffered my own fair share of hardships and mistreatment. But I've never complained or harboured grudges and have always remained completely professional in the way I approach my work. I left a good job in the mining industry to become a detention officer, and I sacrificed many career opportunities along the way because I fundamentally believed in the principles of immigration detention and because I believe that the Department of Home Affairs had the interest of the Australian people at their heart. I no longer believe this to be the case, and I see the department now as a collection of egos, each with their own agendas and their own interests at their heart, rather than the interests of the nation. I have given the department and my former company many opportunities to tell the truth, but they have chosen at almost every opportunity not to engage with me. I think my case raises important issues about the nature of the relationship between government departments and contractors, and I believe that every citizen should have the right to defend themselves against hidden decisions made by faceless people within government departments. I know that there are bigger injustices happening to Australian people, but this is mine and that's why I'm sharing it. I look up to my mum and dad as guides for what it means to have integrity and would like my girls to be able to look up to me and do the same. My mum reckons that apart from those affected, no one could care less about my case and that I'm wasting my time because everyone already knows that life isn't fair. But just because life isn't fair doesn't mean we shouldn't strive to make it fairer. If I don't take this action against my small injustice, then how can I look my daughters in the eye and talk to them about the importance of acting with integrity and standing up for yourself, the way my parents showed me? Now, I'm not going public with my story out of spite, but simply because it's in the public interest and raises questions about the internal affairs within the Department of Home Affairs. I advised ABF after they finally provided reasons for their actions that I was not satisfied with their response and requested an independent investigation, stating that if such an investigation found that ABF's actions were proper, that I would accept that decision and move on, but that if I did not receive a response by Anzac Day 2022, that I would go public with my case. On the 28th just as I was preparing the first video, I did receive a response from ABF that they were not going to investigate my case and considered the matter closed. So here we are. As a result of my termination and the resulting damage to my reputation, I found it almost impossible to find comparable work within the security industry. After all, who wants to employ a security manager who had their right to work removed by Australian Border Force and who doesn't have any work references? The prospect of me giving my all to another employer after the treatment I received from Serco and the department also frightened me. So for this reason, I chose instead to start up my own handyman company called Handy Andy, and I invite you to check it out. I offer great value handyman, landscaping and other services, and unlike my previous employer, I can guarantee that I absolutely do care about providing the best level of service that I can. Building this business over the last year has been hard at almost 48 years of age, and I've discovered muscles that I'd forgotten I had. But I've also received more job satisfaction in 1 year than I did working 10 years in immigration detention, where I think most people don't really know or care about whatever it is they're trying to achieve. So, if you have any jobs at home that you don't have the time or energy for, then please consider Handy Andy. You can find me at handyandyhandy.com. That's handyandyhandy.com. With much gratitude, I ask if you could also visit and like my website and go onto my Facebook page and stuff like that, because that helps with the search engine thingy-mabobs. So, if you managed to make it to the end of my rant, I humbly thank you, and I also urge you to like and share this post in the hope that the government departments will get the message that they have to stop unfairly meddling in the lives of honest, hard-working Australians. Thank you for watching, and remember that every right taken away from you by big government is one that will very unlikely be returned. Goodbye, friends. All the best. How was that? Quite like this social commentary stuff. I might do more.